Hello, everyone out there. We welcome everyone who's joining us now on Facebook. Welcome to our Manitoba Museum at Home pop-up talk today. Today, our presentation is going to be called The Right to Live. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Esyllt Jones, who will be joining us from the U of M. So Esyllt, if you just want to join us here. Hello.
Hey.
Hi. And so yeah, we're so pleased to have you here. I'm really excited about this talk. You know, it's the 100th anniversary or 101st anniversary this year of the Winnipeg General Strike. And we at the museum, we've been talking, a lot about the Winnipeg General Strike for the last year. But I have to say, since the current pandemic and the lockdown and closures of things, I've suddenly, been asking myself all sorts of new questions about, what it must have been like during the strike, but also the importance of the influenza pandemic as something that preceded the strike. And so we're so pleased to have you here today to speak about that.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it a little bit and
Great.
Answer questions.
Great. Yeah, so what we'll do is Esyllt is going to give us a short presentation, and then we'll be taking some questions. So if you're joining us on Zoom, you can write your questions at any time in the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can write your questions in the comments, and they will be relayed to us. So Esyllt, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So I'm going to try to share my slides here with everyone for my presentation. There we go. Let's see, there we are. I wrote a book that was published quite a long time ago now in 2007 called Influenza 1918, Disease, Death, and Struggle in Winnipeg. And it was really an attempt to understand the influenza pandemic from the perspective of working class and immigrant people who lived in Winnipeg at the time. And I've always been really interested, not just during influenza, but in other disease outbreaks globally, what the relationship might be between this frequent coincidence of various kinds of resistance movements, revolt, revolutionary movements that arose during periods of epidemic disease. And so my book tried to pose some ways of thinking about that. And, like Anya says, now that we're living through this, it does a couple of things, especially since the emergence of Black Lives Matter and anti-racist struggles over the last few weeks. We can suddenly sort of almost feel what it's like to live through a moment when you have both very serious infectious disease outbreaks on a global scale and resistance movements emerging with a whole new sort of depth and power to them. So like Anya, I've been rethinking this history and looking at ways in which I might deepen my understanding about that issue. So what I want to do today is to talk about what happened during flu, but also what things were like in terms of health inequalities for Winnipeggers in that period. And I want to start with a slide. Oh, my slide doesn't want to move on for me. There we go. A slide that is a quote from a woman who wrote regularly about health issues for The Voice, which was the labor press's newspaper, the labor movement's newspaper. And she was speaking specifically here about consumption. So, give to everyone the right to live, improve working conditions, and remove the cause of the workman's fear, that when old and unfit for employment, he will starve. And the quote goes on to say, and many a consumptive case will be prevented. So I want to highlight this quote because it shows from 1907, because it shows the extent to which working people had an analysis of health, including an analysis of the causes of infectious disease, that really privileged or highlighted the importance of social context. And in this case, especially working conditions and the situation of male breadwinners. More generally, I want to talk a bit about the sorts of inequalities that people faced at the time, both in terms of income and living conditions, but also poor access to medical care. So, of course, there was no Medicare in 1918-19. And there were these ongoing issues of trust between public health practitioners and especially those living in poorer ethnic neighborhoods, especially the North End, most famously in Winnipeg. So there was a lot of infectious disease circulating in Winnipeg at the time. Most of these were what we refer to as endemic diseases, that is, diseases that kind of came and went on a regular basis. Many of them had evolved into being childhood diseases as a result, so diphtheria, measles, scarlet fever, and so on. And public health was very familiar with how to manage those sorts of disease outbreaks. But its attitude toward why people were vulnerable to those diseases tended to be very based in ethnic and class stereotypes, particularly about the role of mothers, immigrant mothers in particular. So that had affected in some ways the relationship of trust or the feelings of trust between ordinary people and public health officials. We also want to remember that trust in the state might have been limited, especially for European immigrants in this period, because of the impact of the war itself, and the internment of so-called enemy aliens, the censorship of the press. All foreign language press had to be published in English during that period. The labeling of Eastern European immigrants, particularly Jewish immigrants, as alien Bolsheviks or as coming from revolutionary or radical perspectives. So these aspects of the relationship between the immigrant community, especially, and the state, as well as with the labor movement of the state, were complicated. There were quite unsafe living and working conditions. In the slide here is an image from 1910 taken by Louis Benjamin Foote. An image like this reveals the very poor quality of housing, little ventilation, lack of hot running water for people. And these conditions were already well known by health officials and others to be a risk factor for diseases like tuberculosis. The majority of homes in the North End had no bathing facilities. Housing report from the fall of 1918 said in the North End, we find the most families living in 1, 2, and 3 room suites. The houses are older, the rooms are smaller, and there are more children to the family. There are 3,199 children living in the North End districts, and 1,100 of these children belonging to families, none of whom have more than 3 rooms. In District 4, which was part of the North End, only 2 houses out of 417, and in District 5, only 12 houses of 515 have the storm windows so arranged that they may be opened. So the vast majority of people who were living in rental housing couldn't open their windows to ventilate their spaces. This is why an infectious disease, a respiratory disease like influenza, was so very dangerous in these neighborhoods, and why it really tended to move through entire families once one person was infected. Another risk to housing was the existence of a fuel shortage at the time. And this is something I'd actually like to do more research into, because a lot of people in Winnipeg were burning a kind of coal for heating at this point called lignite coal, or sometimes it was referred to as bitumen coal, which is the most harmful to human health because of the off-gassing that occurs. So we see some very basic problems with living conditions, and of course working conditions were also an issue. I'm sorry, something's happening here. Can you still see my screen? There we go. Okay. Increased cost of living. From 1910 to 1919, the cost of living in Winnipeg rose by 42%. or 68%. At the tail end of that period, between 1915 and 18, costs increased by 42%. And if the cost of clothing was included, that increase was nearly 47%. So while wages were stagnant, there were very rapid increases in the cost of living. And then I just want to talk really briefly about spatial and social segregation. So 71% of all skilled, unskilled workers, according to an urban geographer, Dan Hebert, resided in the area of Winnipeg north of Notre Dame Avenue. And almost all European immigrants lived north of the CPR yards. So this is why he argues that there's quite a bit of ethnic spatial segregation occurring in Winnipeg in that period. So now I want to show the differential rates of influenza mortality. And the two numbers that really matter to us are the ones that are indicated by the red flag there, the red arrow. The data on the number of cases, which is the first line, I think is probably highly unreliable because, like with COVID-19 today, we don't know if everyone's reporting cases. There was also no diagnostic test for influenza at the time. Influenza hadn't been isolated as a virus, and it wouldn't be so until the early 30s. So the one that's more reliable is the deaths per thousand population. And there we can see the difference between District A, south of the Assiniboine River, and District D, which is in the North End. So that differential mortality, of course, reflected an underlying problem that I try to get at in my work, which is the experiential differences that people were encountering during this outbreak. And it is a lot like thinking about the experiential differences in places like urban centers in the US, where a disproportionate number of those contracting and dying from COVID are people of color. So we want to think about how the experience of living through the pandemic is very different for them from those who live in more protected places, where because of their class or their race or a combination of both, they're less vulnerable to the disease. And one of the things I've thought about in my work quite a bit is how people survive the pandemic, especially in the absence of any real welfare state, certainly compared with today. And one of the things I think that makes a difference in terms of the strike in 1919 is this question of mutual aid, where there were longstanding traditional networks of mutual aid and dependence. And many of these were ethnically organized by ethnic group. Some of them were organized through trade unions. The Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, who I have an image of here, were one of those trade unions who I discovered in their records had regular sick visiting, for example. So members of their union would go and visit each other when there was sickness involved. They also played a key role in fundraising, for instance, for influenza widows or for men who were temporarily disabled by influenza. So there were these formal institutions, and then there were informal networks of care that operated more at a neighborhood or extended family or community level. And those ones are a lot more difficult to trace for a historian. And, you know, there is oral history that's been done that emphasizes this importance of neighbors and kin. And that continues past the end of the epidemic itself into the period during which people are trying to recover and in some cases reconfigure their lives. So one of the things about that flu pandemic is that most of its victims were people between the ages of 20 and 50. So many of them had young children, and the impact on families is something that I do talk about in my work. I don't have a lot of time today to go into it, but if anyone wants to ask me a question about it, I'd be happy to talk about it, because there were a lot of children who lost one or both parents. I don't know exactly how many, but it was a significant number. So those networks of mutual aid are something that really grew stronger during the influenza outbreak, partly out of necessity, right? Partly because there wasn't a lot of support available to people. There wasn't a lot of access to medical care, but there also wasn't a lot of income support and so on. And some people were directly affected by public closures and received no wage compensation, but hundreds and hundreds of others were just affected by becoming ill or having family members become ill. And because of the tendency of flu to go through entire families, often they needed support in order to survive, and it could make a big difference if you had that kind of support to provide some basic care if you became ill. So mutual aid is kind of lying underneath, I think, and is related to these issues of social inequality that I talked about before. And this is one of the reasons that I like to think about how people may have been affected in terms of their sense of solidarity and in terms of their sense of how to understand their experience. And for a long time, I've worked with this work by Evan Stark, a sociologist who wrote a bit about the history of infectious disease, especially yellow fever in the United States. Epidemics are done by and with as well as two people. So this is a dynamic phenomenon constituted politically as well as scientifically in the struggles that circulate along with physical illness. And when I read this quote now, I just think about this phrase, the struggles that circulate along with physical illness. And it isn't necessarily that we see a straight line, one causes the other. It's that they are happening at the same time and are connected to each other, I think, in a large part because of the way in which people live their ordinary lives. Sometimes there is linkages between long-standing social inequalities and epidemic disease through a particular form of social or political leadership. So when we consider the history of cholera, for example, in the 19th century, which was a disease that was very, very closely linked to the emergence of capitalism and especially the Industrial Revolution in places like Great Britain, Germany, other parts of Western Europe, where the social implications of the Industrial Revolution were very harsh. So cholera emerges out of Asia into Europe in that context. But at the same time, we see there are a lot of very strong political voices that emerged during that period for greater rights, liberal revolutions in favor, for example, of greater political rights, but also deeper understandings of the marginalization of working people, like the Communist Manifesto, which was published the same year as cholera's second big wave in Europe. So this idea that these things are circulating at the same historical moment is how I like to think of them. And now that we're living through a moment like that, I think we can start to see more clearly what that looks like. So those are my thoughts.
So thank you so much, Esyllt. So much to unpack in there. That was wonderful. Yeah, myself, with the pandemic and the lockdown, it sort of was something that would have been unimaginable even just a few months ago, that so many just basic things could stop. So that was sort of one of my questions that I had, and everyone else is welcome to put questions into the chat or into the Facebook, and we'll relay them over to us. But do you think that the disruptions of the pandemic sort of made the possibility of such a large general strike as, to sort of open people's eyes to the fact that things can stop and can change? Does that kind of make sense as a question?
Well, I think epidemic outbreaks always sort of highlight inequality in the way that we see today. And it isn't that these inequalities are usually very new to people. It's just that they become front and center. And it's an interesting, I think, paradox between a situation like a global pandemic where, there's this we're all in this together sort of sense. in other words, it's a society-wide and even worldwide or regionally wide experience. But at the same time, we can very quickly grasp the impact of social inequality on who's affected. So it's an interesting kind of thing to play around with, you know, the shared experience, while recognizing that aspects of the experience are not in fact shared. And I think there's a natural justice piece that comes into play. And you find, I think there's a capacity for pushing the boundaries of inequity harder. And in the case of the general strike, you know, right up against the limits of what the state would tolerate in terms of resistance.
And so one of the questions we have here is, did activists say in the general strike explicitly use the pandemics to sort of highlight unfairness and inequality, specifically from their experience here in Winnipeg?
During the general strike itself, no. But you know, so the third wave of the influenza pandemic in Winnipeg is in about February, March, April of 1919. So there's a first wave that nobody really notices in Canada. Then there's the big fall wave, and then there's a smaller wave in the spring. And between the second and the third waves, the trade union movement was very active, lobbying City Hall for wage replacement for those workers who had, there were several hundred of them, who had lost their wages for 6 weeks while they worked in places of entertainment. So movie theaters, live theater, billiard parlors, places like that. Unlike today, many of those workers were unionized. So there was that, and then there was also a public inquiry which had been called for by the labor members of City Council into the price of burial, and burial becomes a very significant issue during the pandemic here, as it does elsewhere, because not because of mass burial, but because of the cost of burial. So Helen Armstrong was among those advocating for that public inquiry, and there was an election in, now I'm not going to be able to remember the date, a municipal election just before Christmas, and Labor at that point controlled half of City Council. So they attempted to raise those issues that were directly pandemic related. Yeah. But there wasn't the same kind of awareness around differential mortality exactly as we see today. Yeah.
And how well known was all that at the time? Was that coming out in the newspapers and such? Like, we're so bombarded by all this in the media. How would you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, one of my main sources was the labor press, in addition to the mainstream press. And so those issues were covered there. And the reason I know that unions were involved in providing mutual aid support is from the archival collections. There's a small handful of archival collections from skilled trades at the Manitoba Archives. So in the media, there were, especially in the labor press, there were discussions of how important it was to support people who had lost family members, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Yeah, and that certainly would be a role that the unions were fighting for death benefits and things like that.
Yeah.
And what always amazes me about the Winnipeg General Strike is that it was not only supported by the union movement, but also so broadly by the community of non-unionized workers.
Yeah.
That's
always the more difficult history to trace, is the involvement of all of these workers who were not unionized. So, and their families, presumably. So in that way, I you know, it's interesting to see some of the sort of suggestiveness around anti-racism movements, where you see suddenly that the base of it is broadened somehow.
Yes.
And because it's right in the middle of COVID, we can understand. Yesterday, I was reading something about a teenager who's established, he's a 17-year-old in the United States, who's established one of the leading COVID tracking websites in the world. And he also started a protest tracker. So you can now go and track protests by state in the US on his website. And when you do that, he has information about upcoming protests. And then on the right-hand side of his screen, he has all the COVID data for that state. It's really, like, for a historian, this is just super fascinating to see, you know. And he's just doing it. He's just lining them up, right? He's not coming up with a theory for why that's the case, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has such a feeling that, you know, we're living through a moment of history. And, you know, certainly for the, you know, the generation of 17-year-olds, you know, who, you know, this has impacted them so personally, you know, not graduating, but, you know, that this will be a way that they will, you know, view the world for the rest of their lives. So, yeah, it will be quite fascinating to see what historians make of this time period. And let's see what other questions we have there.
There's a question about whether pandemics are radicalizing overall. I think it's very dependent. It's also depending on who you're talking about. So in some cases, resistance during pandemics, and this is especially true in the 19th and early 20th century in colonized contexts, so where the state is much more coercive than what liberal democracies will accept. And there you see resistance very directly related to things like the removal of sick people from their homes, the burning of property for public health reasons, the compulsion for legal compulsion for isolation. And there, sometimes those things happen in the 19th century in Canada too, in relation to cholera and smallpox. And sometimes they're just much more immediate forms of resistance that aren't necessarily pegged to a larger political movement. So it depends where you're talking about and what opportunities are kind of taken up by the leadership too of radical movements. Because I think that piece, how disease becomes politicized, that's a next step to sort of give a voice to what people are living through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, such interesting times. Yeah, and as I say, future historians will certainly look at this time period, and it'll be interesting to see what the long-term consequences of all of this are, and hopefully some positive change will come. And I just see one last question.
Whether or not, the big demonstrations that coincided with the strike. Well, I don't know about whether there was, I don't remember reading anything about there being concerns with flu, partly timing, I think. But, you know, the biggest crowd gatherings that occurred right in the heart of the fall wave were the armistice celebrations, which all went ahead in Winnipeg. So you can see, when you're looking at those photos of celebration of the Armistice Day, you're looking at a community at the peak of the fall wave when there were hundreds of new cases every day. And authorities didn't, I guess for one reason or another, feel that they could stop those celebrations from occurring. They could not possibly have helped the situation, right? Because those celebratory parades were quite large. Yeah.
Huh, that's just fascinating. Yeah, no, I certainly see how it's sort of a whole new aspect of history that I myself had not appreciated before. And we're so happy that you joined us today. This was really just fascinating.
Thanks for asking me. Yeah.
Oh, well, our pleasure, our pleasure. And so for those of you who are interested in the Winnipeg General Strike, our exhibit, Strike 1919, Divided City, is still on display at the Manitoba Museum. We are open on weekends during June, so please come on down and visit us. And also we've often had the question about how you can support the museum during this time. Currently, the museum is part of a campaign through CanadaHelps.org, where any funding given donations to the museum will have possibility to grow from there. So check us out on CanadaHelps.org. But thank you so much again, Esyllt, and thank you everyone else out there for joining.